Hello and welcome to episode 1 of Deep Dive Designs. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the weird and wonderful world of Frisbees and the evolution of it being nothing to it being that thing you take out in camping because it's about £2 and you found it in your shed. The origins of the Frisbee is actually probably older than you think, with us actually having records from ancient Greece in 760 BC in the Olympics. And the reason the Frisbee was actually mentioned is because it was a part of an event called the pentathlon, and this event was basically just a collection of like the manliest sports you possibly could have, which kind of all derived from like different skills you would use in battle. So there would be things such as javelin throwing or discus, which is basically where the origins of the Frisbee came from, because it was kind of to see how far you could throw a shield. And then say with the pentathlon, as most Greek things kind of end up going towards, the end of it was actually naked wrestle. To just give you some perspective on how old the Frisbee actually is, the event of the Olympics was actually 800 years before the Romans even decided to come to England, say hi, and then murder everyone. The oldest Frisbee, well, I mean, we call it Frisbee, but being honest, it's kind of being quite loose with the word Frisbee, as it is just essentially a shield, as that's what the event was back at the time, was just to see how far you can throw a shield. But this shield was actually dated all the way back to 460 to 450 BC, and the reason we actually found this is because apparently it was a gift from Zeus, which is kind of mental, because it was like the gift for whoever won the Olympic Games, which always made me think it's essentially like Jesus coming down and giving Usain Bolt a pair of Nike trainers. Although I kind of mentioned it is probably a bit incorrect calling these Frisbees, it is a fact that the sport of discus has barely changed over the years. So ever since its inception of the Olympics in 760 BC, the sport has essentially just like stayed the same really. It's just the size of it has shrunk a bit, because I mean, imagine now trying to throw a massive shield. However, it is kind of true though, us humans, we like to throw disc-shaped things. We're doing a bit of a time jump now to actually the first recording of Frisbees being used as a leisure activity. I'd say it's a bit of a time jump. The time jump is around about 2,000 years, so here we go on. So the man who apparently founded with Frisbees as a leisure activity was an American man called Walter Morrison. I do have to say though, I think him saying he's the first one to discover throwing a disc is kind of fun. It's essentially like me kicking a rock on the floor and saying I founded football, but I mean he was the founder, and I mean so Walter Morrison did end up actually creating the first ever Frisbee, which is a bit of a spoiler. However, he found this idea through on a Thanksgiving night in 1937 when him and his wife found a little popcorn tin, and I was like, this could be thrown. Because ever since then, they've founded Frisbee. So, according to Mr. Walter Morrison himself, apparently the first ever time anyone found a disc and decided to throw and catch it was on Thanksgiving at his house in 1937, when him and his wife found a lid of popcorn, found out they could throw this and they could catch this, and ever since then, in his eyes, the beautiful game of Frisbee began. So Walter Morrison is actually often known as the grandfather of the Frisbee, or to the Frisbee fandom, he's known as the Frisbee Daddy. And what made Walter Morrison start his journey into becoming the Frisbee overlord we all love and know today actually had nothing to do with him at all. It was actually a pie maker who just sold local pies to the Yale University. And he sold these to the local rapscallions, Yale University. And these students, instead of partying like, I mean, any normal 19 to 20 year old would do, they ended up throwing lids to each other. So the important thing is, where did the name Frisbee actually come from? And that actually came from this Mr. Walter Morrison spying on these young boys. Because when he spied on these young boys, he realised they were shouting something. And that something they were shouting was Frisbee. And you might have noticed, but the name Frisbee has actually caught on over the years. And the reason they were shouting Frisbee was kind of interesting. It's because they actually bought these pie lids from a shop called William Frizz Pies. But anyway, this is actually similar to the reason why hockey pucks are called hockey pucks, because they were named after the guy who invented poker pies. That may be a lie. However, it's important to know it wasn't just Walter Morrison who was spying on these sweaty boys. It was actually his friend as well. But this man, his name was Francino. He's Italian. And he was watching these boys and he had the same idea. And this event of these men staring at these boys would cement them into all of our hearts. So development of the Frisbee didn't actually start until the 1940s, even though these men have stared at these boys for around about 10 years now. I'm not sure if they've been doing it the whole time, but I mean, if you've got nothing else better to do, fair enough. However, they didn't really develop these until the late 1940s because I don't know what, but something was happening between 1939 and 1945. I don't know, maybe someone could tell me. But however, they didn't actually ended up developing this Frisbee until around about 1947. It is also important to note that Mr. Francini and Mr. Walter Morrison both actually did fight in World War II. However, both of them were actually in the Air Force, which is kind of interesting to note because this is where both of them kind of got their knowledge of flight and how things fly, and this may tie into a certain thing they developed later. I wonder what. And there's another important note to mention. They did have some crafting skills. I mean, they didn't go to like university and study product design. However, Francini, he was a well-known carpenter at the time, taking a bit of a note out of Jesus's book. As soon as they finished the war, this was the only thing they really talked about. It's just about how they're going to make their millions, making the Frisbee, making sure it flies, how to make a nice shed. And then, in 1946, finally, the groundwork being made for creation of the first ever Frisbee. So after many obviously sleepless nights and days, they eventually came up with the final design of the first ever Frisbee, the Whirlo way. This was developed in 1947 and it is basically just a bin lid that has just been slightly bent. The design was actually inspired off an aeroplane's wing, as Morrison and Francini were both in the Air Force. So how the design worked, basically similar to an aeroplane wing, as the air is pushed underneath the wing to give it elevation. This is the same kind of concept Morrison and Francini used for the Frisbee, as it had this lip around it and the air would actually go underneath the Frisbee to lift it up from the air. Francini and Morrison didn't end up going with the name Frisbee, mainly just because it was just a copyright issue, especially as the name of Frisbee actually came from William Frisbee, whose last name was literally Frisbee. So they had to find another way, which is where the name Whirlo way came from. And the fun fact about it is actually came from the name of an actual winning racehorse that both of them bet on. That's the weird fact about the name that, let's be honest, isn't very good. The other weird fact is there aren't too many parts actually labelled in the first ever Frisbee. However, the one part they did want to mention was the fact the middle of it was known as the nipple. And a fun fact, the first ever Frisbee was an innie. The start of the Frisbee story is actually probably a bit more of a negative than you might think, as the name Whirlo way just was awful, and I think the fact it just come from a horse, it does kind of show the fact there wasn't much thought put into the name. There was an attempt to rebrand the Frisbee into what you probably actually know it as with some of you, especially in America, as the flying saucer, mainly just because there was a lot of alien-y things happening back in the 1940s, with many people saying they spotted UFOs, some of them just having quite bad eyesight. However, this rebrand, once again, just didn't work. It didn't work to such a fact that the company Morrison and Francisco had together, Pipco, actually went up going bust in about 1950, with Francini himself putting in around about $5,000. Just to give you some perspective on how much money Mr. Francisco actually ended up losing, in today's money, that is around about $63,000. And bearing in mind, this wasn't just his money as well, this is money he got from his family members. They weren't too happy with the ultimate fact that, let's be fair, it was just a major disaster. And Mr. Francisco, he ended up just being like, you know what, I can't lose any more everyone's life savings. So Francisco ended up running for the hills with absolutely nothing. And this is kind of an important thing to mention because obviously nowadays Frisbee is so popular and you can't imagine it ever being a failure. However, this man, he spent his entire life on it, thousands of pounds worth of his family's money. He's no royalties or anything. It's kind of a bit of a sad story for Mr. Francisco. But anyway, with Morrison, however, he did actually end up selling the rights to the Frisbee to Whammo in 1955. Quick history behind behind Whammo are founded by two Californian men. Well, I'll say men, they were around about in their 20s at the time before founding Whammo. One named Richard Neer and the other Anther Spud Mellon. But these two boys ended up making it big in around about 1948 when they founded the company, as they came across a little toy known as the Australian exercise hoop, or as you may know it as, the hula hoop. Although the two lads from Whammo were very successful, there was one thing they weren't very good at, and that was designing. However, they did have one very good strength, and that was they were bloody good at marketing. And they found that the Flying Saucer wasn't a great name, the Whirlaway even worse of a name, so they settled on a nice little bit of alliteration, the Plato Platter, and it came with its own little space license. So if any policeman caught you playing with your little toy, you can show them that, and then they'll probably won't do anything. This was Whammo's way of going full speed with the fact that Frisbees are actually UFOs, and instead of abducting kids, they were more flying into the face of them. Another key to their success was the fact it was actually made of quite a soft plastic, and this plastic was the world's most favourite polluting material, polyethylene. Although the Plato Platter was definitely popular, it wasn't as popular as it could have been, and this is probably because of the fact, if you actually look at the old designs, the Plato Platter was basically just a bin lid that was a little bit small and it had the edges just curved slightly. This does make sense considering Whammo didn't really touch the design, and Morrison, he was basically a carpenter, so if the Frisbee was a door, it probably would have been a little bit better. However, there was one key man who did end up redefining what the Frisbee was. And this man, he wasn't just a carpenter, he was Ed Hedrick, a man who just came out of his old job and really wanted to be a toy maker. So the story goes, Ed Hedrick, he was originally wanted to be a toy designer and actually approached Whammo asking for the job. However, they had a bit of a problem because, being honest, the Plato Platter wasn't selling amazingly and the hula hoop craze was absolutely dead and buried by now. However, because of the death of the hula hoop, Whammo did have an insane amount of excess polyethylene. If no one's going to buy them, where do you put the hula hoops? You put them in a massive skip. And this actually was the thing that made Ed Hedrick a lot of money. So, as the tale goes, Whammo approached Hedrick and said, "We won't give you a toy designer role. However, if you can do something with this absolute mountain of excess polyethylene, you'll get the job." So Mr. Hedrick was on his way. While Hedrick was looking at this plastic, he did stumble across the little thing called the Plato Platter. This was something that Whammo still had in its IP, and the key fact about the Plato Platter the whole time is it didn't actually fly that well, although the design has been going on since 1947. Very little changes have actually changed from the design of it just being a pie tin lid. So Hedrick's thought process was, if I could make this into something that actually doesn't fly like a roof tile, can it be successful? And this train of thought has led to the Frisbee we all know in modern day, and his design turned this little disc into something that has been a toy for everyone and actually been turned into a sport as well. The key things that Hedrick actually wanted to improve on was mostly just make sure it flies alright, make sure it's stable, and actually to make sure you can catch the thing. So what he ended up doing was he raised some rings along the outside of the Frisbee, which he modestly named the Hedrick Lines. Thank you very much, you're very welcome. Then he also altered the shape of the lips. That actually allows the air to flow underneath a lot better, because the old designs, say they were based off the airplane wing, but it was basically just a dent. It was just a plate, and that had just been smashed from the inside. Like, there were very little designs to it. So he actually designed it so the air would actually stay underneath the Frisbee and actually help it glide along a lot further. The interesting thing, these two little changes actually improved the Frisbee so much, and that turned it into something that he actually absolutely loved. Like, this man, he took care of this Frisbee design as it was his own little baby. He loved it, and he loved it so much that after 1967, when he patented it, he founded the International Frisbee Association. He even founded Frisbee Golf and Ultimate Frisbee, which was a sport I played for exactly one day. However, this man, he found no faults whatsoever, and this man was so dedicated that when Ed Hedrick unfortunately passed away in 2002, he actually wanted his ashes to be turned into a Frisbee itself, and you can actually still see Mr. Hedrick as a Frisbee in the Frisbee Museum. And I personally believe if it wasn't for Ed Hedrick, I don't think the Frisbee would be anywhere near as popular it is, as his design actually shot Frisbee into the mainstream. By 1977, Hedrick's Frisbee sold over 100 million, which is absolutely insane, and I'm sure Francisco was absolutely crying at this point. However, as most good things end up, once there is one, there are many. And as we're about to see, after the success of the Frisbee took off, many variations of it ended up coming into the mainstream. So many companies wanted to copy the success of Whammo. So this ended up with so many variations of the Frisbee that there is no way I'll be able to talk about them all. However, I will highlight a few of my favourites. One being the fact that there were so many glow-in-the-dark Frisbee. This was because in 1970s, glow-in-the-dark toys was like crack to children. They just couldn't get enough of it. I mean, this might be a bit of an exaggeration, but apparently because it was such a new technology, as it was only developed in 1971 and was originally just used as a light source in submarines. However, it only took until 1975 until glow-in-the-dark Frisbee started absolutely flying into the shelves and ultimately into the neighbour's garden, because even though it's glow in the dark, it's still pretty hard to see. At the height of Frisbee mania in around about 1980s, every single company saw the success of Frisbees and ultimately really wanted to use it to actually promote their products. So this led to some of my absolute favourite collabs of all time. Most famously, it was McDonald's who were the one who was absolutely obsessed with Frisbees and their Happy Meals, with there being actually surprising amount of variations of Ronald McDonald's face on a load of different plastic plates, and one that I especially love with Ronald McDonald just hanging on in the middle of one, just holding on to dear life. And this Frisbee, in fact, can actually set you back around about £10 if you wanted to buy it nowadays. Other famous collaborations included the DARE program in America, who thought the one way to get kids off drugs was to make sure they would play with a Frisbee. And also another collaborator, which is a bit of a rogue one, was actually the Christian Christ Church, as there were multiple ministries I found online who had their own variation of the Frisbee, because I'm pretty sure that's what Jesus would have wanted. As you probably can imagine, over the years, the market got substantially more saturated over the years. And the fact was, if you were a kid, especially in the 90s or 80s, what would you rather do? Would you rather throw a plastic disc in your garden, or would you rather sit inside and destroy your friends in Mortal Kombat or other games such as Pokemon? The answer is kind of obvious, so this kind of led to the craze of the Frisbee ultimately dying, until once again there was a man. He was no ordinary man, this was a man who had something no one before actually had. He had some knowledge of physics. So this man, his name was Alan Adler, and he developed something that I think was just made popular, especially in my era, as it was briefly shown in the In-Betweener series. Of course, I'm talking about the Aerobee Pro. Alan Adler was an engineer at Stanford, so he actually knew his stuff, unlike the other man who kind of flew a plane and kind of knew a bit about carpenting. And basically, he just used basic physics in it, thinking about a way how to make this Frisbee fly as far as possible. His design was actually inspired off very much the Australian Frisbee, also known as the boomerang. The Aerobee was basically just a cursed child between the the boomerang and a frisbee that went on a crash diet, as this thing was super light and was basically just a ring. So what Alan Adler actually ended up doing with the frisbee is he ended up having silicone around the outside, so again it wouldn't actually kill your hands every time you try to catch it. And so the fact it was so light, it wouldn't actually hurt when you smack your friend around the face with it. And his design was so good at making the Aerobo not just go further, but actually more stable as well, as the Aerobo Pro was actually tested, as he managed to throw his frisbee over 1,257 feet. Just to give you an idea of how insanely far that is around about 4 Big Bens, or 210 Ben Afflecks, depending on which Ben you're actually throwing to. Fact is, to manage to throw the Aerobo Pro 1,257 feet, you would have to be some man with some insane shoulder strength. However, the fact was, these frisbees were so much better, and as you guessed, it reignited the frisbee phrase, as I remember every single child when I was younger, they would always pick out one frisbee, and that would be the Aerobo Pro. This does kind of show that even though this is a design that has been going on since the 1940s, there is still room for improvement. That does kind of change the philosophy. If something is broken, maybe it's actually broken and you should change it. Obviously, this wasn't the last frisbee, as there were so many I ended up going through. As you got the fan frisbee, you've got the Aerobo. Alright, I just have to say a massive thank you to everyone who's actually managed to make it this far into the podcast or video, depending what I do with it. I mean, this is actually my first ever episode, so I mean, if some things might sound a bit weird, that's probably the reason why. I would really appreciate any kind of support, like any likes, any comments you want to put into the comment section. There is one thing I do have to mention though. I'm kind of sorry. I've got this really weird posh voice when I start recording things. So if it starts grating on you, that would also be helpful to let me know. But anyway, thank you so much for listening. And I mean, if you like these, there are going to be many more to come over the years. So please stick around. And yeah, thank you for watching.